Welcome to the #CNF podcast. I am your host, Brendan O'Mara. My guest today is John Scheinman. He is the Eclipse Award-winning writer of Memories of a Master, about famed horse trainer Dickie Small. John is a acclaimed turf rider, and for those who don't know who turf riders are, it's just people who historically cover horse racing. We talk about a lot of stuff, especially the anxiety that comes with interviewing people, something that I wrestle with every time I pick up the phone. John's a friend, a seasoned pro, and just a cool dude to talk to. So that's about it. So if you listened last week to the conversation with Maggie Messett, thank you very much. It's always up on iTunes for free, so go ahead and download it if you want to hear that. Otherwise, just stay tuned for episode 9 with John Scheinman. 3, 2, 1 podcast.
Hello?
Hey, John.
Hey, how are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Oh, yeah, let's talk.
Cool. All right. Well, let's the Derby is just a few weeks away, so let's talk horses to start. So, I know you've been following that closely, as you always do. So, who do you like so far?
Well, I don't know if I'm following it as closely as I always do, but I've been watching the prep races. I haven't been taking copious notes like I have in the past. I'm not like beat reporting it, so things are a little changed. But I've been stuck on this horse for a while. That was a real late returner to the 3-year-old from 2-year-old to 3-year-old campaigns, and it's a horse named One Lucky Dane that is like the 3rd or 4th string in the Baffert barn. And this horse made his 3-year-old debut after finishing 6th in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile, and he won by 9.5 lengths in a mile at Santa Anita. And then he came back in the Santa Anita Derby and raced with his stablemate, the undefeated Dortmund, who many people, Dortmund will go into the Kentucky Derby as one of the few horses. He's going to go in as a horse that's undefeated. He's not the only one. There have been others, but I think he's 6 for 6, and he's highly rated. And yet I haven't abandoned One Lucky Dane, who came in 2nd in the race. If you watch the race, One Lucky Dane is off of Dortmund's right flank, and then there's another horse supplying very heavy pressure to One Lucky Dane, who is stuck in between. And if you follow horse racing, you know that that's a bad trip to be between horses going around the track. It's generally too much pressure, and they get overwhelmed. So when they hit the far turn, he began to drop back, and I said, well, that's the end of him. But as they come into the stretch, he rallies back into 2nd place and is pulling away from the rest of the field. And so he's going to be completely under the radar, and I'm pretty sure he's got enough points to get into the Kentucky Derby. And there's a very esoteric, old-school handicapping angle, which I probably shouldn't be giving out, on the weight. And there's people that know that I talk about this and think I'm nuts, but it's called the wave pattern. And what the wave pattern is if you would literally draw a wave and show the horse on the lead and then dropping back and coming again, and it would form a wave line. And to me, it's a very strong angle as a preparation to move forward. And I think this horse will probably be 30 or 40 to 1 and forgotten, and he's my Derby horse.
Nice. Well, yeah, a few years ago, you were very high on Animal Kingdom, and he was a horse I think that was very under the radar, having won his preps on synthetic tracks. And so I'm sure maybe this horse will be similar to, at least in terms of the attention not garnered, to a horse like Animal Kingdom.
Yes, well, segue a little bit into the project that you and I worked on, Kentucky Confidential. We had Kerry Thomas, who some people call a horse whisperer, who looks at certain kinds of dynamics of how horses interact with each other in the field, and and then translates them to the racetrack. And he was very high on Animal Kingdom, and he was one of the people that I had hired on for that KentuckyConfidential.com project, and he picked Animal Kingdom. And we also ranked Animal Kingdom in our top two, me and my handicapping brother, Action Andy Andrews, who was also brought on. And so we really made a splash by selecting Animal Kingdom. I don't know if I think of as highly of One Lucky Day, but I think extremely highly of him, and he's going to be at least a bigger price as Animal Kingdom. So maybe there's some more money to be made here.
Yeah, Kerry's approach is just so innately biological, which I kind of like. You know, he looks at those herd dynamics and just how these horses socialize with each other on the track. It's a very unique way and kind of eerily accurate. I think he had I'll Have Another as one of his other big horses.
I think he just picked it year after year. One of his top 3 or 4 picks wins the Derby ever since I've known him. And he did it again last year, and he even had Danza, and he just, you know, he's very good at this. The funny thing about it is that sometimes everything has to be in place for the horse, though, for that thing to work. And a perfect example was Orb. When Orb was crescendoing in his year before he won the Kentucky Derby, when he was in Florida racing, when he would come down the lane, the other horses would literally get out of the way like there was a bad man coming down the alley and they were crossing to the other side of the sidewalk, or a bad dog, and that they just literally stepped aside. But after the Derby, that kind of authority and influence over the other animals seemed to diminish. So if he went off form, or he was tired and losing weight, or whatever the reasons were, that kind of presence just disappeared in his subsequent races. So I think there's got to be more in place than that, but I put a lot of credence into what Kerry Thomas does anyway.
Absolutely. And so how did you get your start covering horse racing?
Well, I think we have time here, so I can tell you a good story.
Definitely.
I was a long-time horse player and had done a tremendous amount of reading about the sport in my formative years following it. And when I worked at a community newspaper called the Montgomery Journal, which was a very, very good paper, any opportunity I had to get horse racing into the paper, I would do it. So I'd always, and I got to cover the DC International, and I really I was in love with the sport. Well, I was working at a company called Phillips Publishing, and I had these really high-level Fortune 200 type newsletters that I was writing that cost they were easily, I don't know, $2,000 a year to subscribe to them, and I was pretty much writing them myself. And it was the EFT report and electronic commerce news, and just this, I was pretty much documenting the rise of the internet for business-to-business electronic commerce. Mm-hmm. And my boss went on maternity leave, who I adored to this day, and then she decided to quit and raise children instead of come back to work. And I was sort of like the boy wonder in this company. And I didn't come to work on time like anyone else. I would just sort of saunter in when I woke up, whenever that was. And but I was just hauling in awards and successes, and so I was doing really great until my boss left, and the new boss came in to decide that she was going to make an example of me and put me under her thumb. Mm. I tendered my resignation fairly quickly because I couldn't work in that kind of environment. So I had no job, and
when was this?
This is 1999.
Okay.
I literally had no job. Well, simultaneously going on at the Washington Post, there's a great writer and a good friend of mine named Dave McKenna. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he had a column called Cheap Seats in the City Paper, which is the alternative weekly in Washington, D.C. for a long time. Excellent column, excellent writer, sports, music. He's very versatile, and he's a great guy. And he was a freelancer, and he had gotten this kid. They never put a full-time writer back after Vinnie Peroni on the Washington Post horse racing beat. And McKenna, who didn't really know a lot about racing, was covering it as best as he could. He loved it, but he didn't have that depth of knowledge that makes a really good racing writer. So So anyway, this is a winding story, but I think it's a good one.
Yeah,
one
keep
of
going.
The founding fathers of sports talk radio is a guy named Ken Beatrice. And he has an encyclopedic memory of not only all the athletes in all the pro sports, but he has all the knowledge of the minor leaguers, too. Mm-hmm. He just knew everything. And he became, like a star on the radio and really helped develop sports talk radio. And he did it when he was in Washington, D.C. So the great columnist Tony Kornheiser, who was working at Newsday on Long Island, got a job at the Washington Post. And one of the first columns he wrote to make his name at the Post was he exposed this radio guy, Ken Beatrice, as a fraud. And said he had made up his background, he didn't really go to the college he went to, and he had basically fabricated his entire background. And he writes this in the Washington Post. And this guy who is a rising star in radio and encyclopedic about all his knowledge of sports virtually had a mental breakdown when he was exposed in the Washington Post by Kornheiser. And he didn't come to work and stopped going on the radio. He basically just locked himself in his home and, kind of freaked out. And they were begging him at the radio station to come to work, saying, the column is immaterial, your history that you fabricated is immaterial, your work is gold, please come back to work. And so he did, and long story short, flash forward maybe 20 years or so later, he is considered a pioneer and beloved throughout the industry. So on the final day when he retires, the flagship sports talk radio station in Washington, WTEM, had a day to fet him on the radio, and they spent the entire day having athletes and writers and all these people from all around the country call in and wish him well and tell stories about having dealt with him across their sports careers. So it was like famous luminaries are all calling into the radio station throughout the day. One of them being Tony Kornheiser, who had written the column that had sent him into hiding, right? So he calls in and he wishes Ken Beatrice well. Well, the following week, in the city paper, Cheap Seats column, Dave McKenna writes a withering assault on Tony Kornheiser. How dare he call in and wish this guy well without apologizing to him for nearly ruining his career 20 years prior. And he dredges up the entire story of what happened, right? George Solomon, the sports editor at the Washington Post, gets a look at this, and he says, are you kidding me? Let me get this straight. My horse racing writer in the Alternative Weekly is lambasting my lead columnist? This is not going to stand. And he fires Dave McKenna as the horse racing writer. And this is 2 weeks after I tendered my resignation at my job. Mm-hmm. A friend of mine happened to work on the sports copy desk at the Washington Post, and he calls me up and tells me the story, and he goes, George knows you because you've covered boxing in the past, and he's seen you at the fights, and he knows who you are. Just come in and tell him you want to be the racing writer. You know everything about horse racing, which I didn't, but I thought I did, but I learned I did. And I said, okay, that sounds great. So I get that, so I call up Solomon, and I make the appointment for the interview. I get down there. He's in this glass-enclosed office in the Washington Post sports department, as if he's like, it's almost like he's protected like the Pope with an impenetrable shield. This is like one of the gods of sports editing in the country. And I walk into his office, and I'm quaking in my shoes and in my suit. I'm terrified of this guy because he's really, a big-time sports editor. And I go in there, and he goes, so, John, you want to try this horse racing thing? I go, yeah. He goes, you're not going to write about Tony, are you? I go, no, I won't. He goes, you got the job. And that was it.
Wow.
That's how I became a horse racing writer. Sorry if it's long-winded, but I think it's a great story.
No, it is. It has all the elements that just it culminates so nice and tightly. And the timing of it was just, how serendipitous was that for you? My goodness.
Oh, well, the company that I had tendered the resignation for, inside 2 months had fired that woman who I couldn't stand working for, and they offered me a job in London, and they offered me a job in New York, making more money than I ever would have made in my life, and I turned them both down to be the horse racing writer at the Washington Post for largely chump change. Because I just couldn't think of a better job than be a horse racing writer at the Washington Post. I couldn't think of a better job.
Right, and when you went in there, you said, well, at least you went in with the mindset that you thought you knew more than you did in horse racing. So how quickly did you realize that your knowledge of the sport and the intricacies of the sport weren't quite up to speed with what you had brought to the table?
Well, they were up to speed largely with what was going on out there, but I realized there was so much more to learn. So I was perfectly functional, but I really began to develop over time, and I realized, and it's one of the reasons that I really was attracted to horse racing, because it felt like, as both a handicapper and a writer, it felt like it could almost be a lifetime avocation because I could keep learning things. There's still so many pieces of equipment, for example, that they use on horses that I don't even know to this day. I've learned some of them over time, but it just became a great learning experience as well as a writing experience to have that job. So, I didn't go in there realizing, oh my God, I'm in over my head. I went in there realizing, oh my God, this is really exciting. There's a lot of stuff that I don't know about. I began to learn about drug policies and how they're differing between the states and all the different rules that go on there. A story would eventually come up, and it would be a teaching experience for me. And that's really gratifying, especially as a sports writer, because some of that type of sports work, it really is not intellectually engaging, and you realize, well, you're just writing about games instead of important things in the world. But in horse racing, I did find that I was being enriched for a long period of time and learning.
Do you find it frustrating or irritating that the horse racing coverage, or just horse racing as a whole, just doesn't latch on to a broader readership than it maybe once did in the past?
Well, it was one of the reasons that one of the principles behind the KentuckyConfidential.com project that we ran for 2 years. What was it, 12 and 13, Brendan? I think that was 2011 and 12.
Yes.
I'm not even. I got to look.
Yeah, I was there on the 2011 team, and you guys did it the year after, and then not in 2013.
Right. Well, one of the guiding principles behind that was to make horse racing something that a wider audience would want to read. And if you remember, well, I actually think you missed the first meeting when I think you came down a little late in the day. But I had put a meeting together of all the people that were going to be on the project that morning, the first morning, in the Churchill Downs press box, and I said to them, everybody introduce yourselves to each other. And they all did and said a little about themselves. And I said, here's the guiding directive of this project. I don't want any news. I don't care if the favorite breaks his leg. I don't want news. You are all here to be storytellers. That was the job. And you were given, I think you were given a column called Bourbon Underworld.
Yeah.
And just to, you were a little bewildered with me, but I remember sending you out to a strip club. Like, talk to strippers about the Kentucky Derby. To me, I wanted to bring racing to a larger world, and I still want to do it. If I continue to write about racing, I am a bit disappointed because I think imagination and desire to do it is lacking, and the monotony of the game it can wear you out if you don't move it into more interesting realms. And I wish there was money out there to do it. I'd be happy to relaunch that project if there was money out there to do it, but there isn't, and yeah, I am disappointed.
Yeah, I was hoping for another crack at that Bourbon Underworld in 2012 because I wanted to do a little more immersive first-person stuff and just kind of get out into the more of the wackiness that goes on. I think I kind of got my legs under myself later in the week there as I just ran into random people at bars, and especially this one guy who just like ushered me around to different bars and then invited me to that party on Oaks Night. That's kind of that stuff was pretty cool eventually, but it was a great sort of medium to do non-newsy stuff. That's my taste and sensibilities is with not doing hard news stuff. It's with the storytelling stuff, and that's why I really wish more people latched onto it, because there was such a rich soil there to grow stories from.
And I think a lot of that is grown on the internet. I mean, I think there are sites out there that are more, I don't even know what they are, so don't ask me, but I think there are sites out there that are moving more towards storytelling. And, you know, I don't want to pat myself too much on the back or anything, but it was a great opportunity for me when the Blood Horse offered me one of their three long-form, well, it's four, the three long-form pieces that went into the Triple Crown last year. And, I mean, what a great opportunity. Two went to Stampers, and I was the freelancer who got one. And I took that ball, and I ran with it as fast as I could. I couldn't believe my fortune to be able to write a piece so long about what I wanted to. And I had rejected the offer that they gave me, which was to write about Sagamore Farm. I said, I don't want to write about Sagamore Farm. And they said, well, what do you want to write about? And I said, Dickie Small. And I wound up winning the Eclipse Award for the story, and it wasn't the Eclipse Award so much as just being able to do it. Just being able to, here's a forum, John. Right. Well, nobody else ever offers me that kind of forum very often, you know, and it's a problem in horse racing, because there's these people, and I guess I'm one of them, that have this potential to really do work that's above and beyond, and nobody's asking for it, and that's a problem.
Yeah, and you brought up a good point, which is something that what motivates me is that I don't really care about, I tangentially care about it, but like of getting into, say, like Best American Sports Writing or winning these nice awards. What I care about is being able to do the type of work that typically gets anthologized. If I get anthologized or whatever, great. But like what you just said is that you were granted this opportunity to do that kind of reporting, to do that writing, and that's where the fulfillment comes from. I mean, anything else is just icing, but it must have just, having that knowledge that you had this free reign to just to speak at length, to report at length, and then to write at length. That must have just been incredibly freeing, liberating, and satisfying.
It was extremely. I mean, a man who was dying gave me the time of his life toward the end of it.
Yep.
You know, you can't beat, and it was not only that; it was a wondrous life. You know, the thing with the awards is it's not what you shoot for, but it's a validation for, yes, this was a great project and you did a good job on it, and that's a good thing. It's good to have that. It's just not what you should be in it for, but it's great to have that.
Right.
You know, saying that this was a good idea. And Blood Horse won 2 of them. And then this year, as far as I know, I don't even see any long-form pieces coming out of them. It's like, wait a minute, you won Eclipse Awards. Why would you stop? Obviously, you were doing something right, that people validated that work with these fine honors. And so I don't fully understand it, but
yeah,
I think racing does need to reach out, because. And I think a lot of the people that make great stories are kind of going away in the game, and it's time to get them. It's time to tell good stories. Who's the favorite for the Derby, and blah, blah, blah. And he's worked for a long time. Oh, my God, I got tired of it. I did it for 10 years.
Yeah.
And I just lost my I love going to gamble on the races, don't get me wrong, but all that kind of grinding type of reporting, you know, the rush of it, I think, disappeared a little bit for me.
Yeah, exactly. Because it just gets incredibly repetitive. It's just formulaic at some point. You know, coming up, it's the same, plug in these values, and it spits out the other end of the equation, and just hit repeat next year. I
know, but it's a funny thing about it is, Brendan, you can be at the track, and it's exciting, and you can watch a horse sizzle through a workout, and it's exciting, and you can get up to Saratoga, and there's tremendous renewal of your spirit when you get there, which is a beautiful thing and a beautiful place. But ultimately, the work that you're tasked to do doesn't meet the measure of the experience, and that's a problem.
Yeah, very good point. I want to get back to your Eclipse Award winning story, which I forgot to when I record an intro after this, I'll be sure to mention it. And I wanted to I got to congratulate you on Facebook, but I didn't get to congratulate you over the phone here. So first, congratulations. What an honor.
Thank you. That's great. That's great.
Yeah. And but how did you come to that story about the Dickie Small, one of the iconic Mid-Atlantic trainers?
Well, I'd always known that he had been in Special Forces, and I'd always wondered how many people did this guy kill. It kind of just stuck in my craw, and I'd had times with Dickie where I would sit when he was still based in Pimlico. I'd wander out, leave the track, and there he is. There he is outside his barn, and I'd wind up talking to him for an hour and a half. It didn't happen a whole lot, but it happened enough. And I really liked the way his mind worked. Sometimes he could be gruff and tough, and sometimes he was extremely expansive. And I just knew he'd have this fascinating life. And I knew he was sick. And I said to myself, I think it's time. I want to do this. And that's how it happened. And I didn't realize the depth of his illness. And as I said in my speech when I accepted the Eclipse Award, I go down to Laurel Park. I didn't tell the whole story, but I said it really quickly because they give you 20 seconds to talk. But I go down to the track for the first day, for the first interview, and this past winter everybody said was really cold, but I kind of felt like 2 winters back was even colder down here in Maryland. And I get to the track, I don't know, maybe 5:45, 6 o'clock in the morning, something like that. There's Dickie in the pickup, sitting between the 8th and the 16th hole, watching his teams work and watching the horses, and he's got somebody else in the cab with him, and he sees me, and he motions the person to leave and for me to get in. And I get in and close the door, and he's got the heat up really high. It was really cold. And I look at him, and I go, and I hadn't seen him in a while, and I said, oh my God. I said this to myself, look at him. It's awful. He's a bag of bones. It was awful. And he turns to me and he goes, so you're here to write my obituary? And I just said, oh, Jesus, this is, I was really taken aback, and I just said, this is going to be super tough. That's what went through my head. This is going to be really, really tough. I've taken on a challenge that might be too big. That's what came immediately into my mind. But it didn't turn out that way at all. It turned out to be, it turned out to be one of the greatest experiences of my writing and reporting life, to be able to just talk with him for hours on end. And he knew what I was there for, and it was almost as if he felt like, he trusted me, and it was great, because I don't know if he would have, I don't know, it just felt, I almost felt I had been picked, even though I picked the story. It almost felt like he picked me as like, okay, I'm going to give it to you. And it was funny, Brendan, like at the end of, we would finish, let's say, an hour and 20-minute talk in his truck, and he was so tired from talking that he's down to a whisper, and he has to go home to bed. And he looks at me, and he goes, don't put any of that stuff in, just write about the horses. He's just giving me an hour, 20 minutes about the jungles of Vietnam. Don't put that in, just write about the horses. Great. And he knew it wasn't just going to be about the horses, but he saw emphasis in. It was just him to say it like that. Self-effacing, very self-effacing. It was beautiful. Beautiful experience.
How were you able to dispel his initial aggression there of him just coming out and saying, oh, so you're here to write my obituary? Because right off the bat there, now he's kind of put you on the ropes, and you have to, over time, sort of massage that feeling out of him to the point where he was ultimately comfortable with you to speak for hours on end.
Well, you couldn't put it any better by saying, like, put me on the ropes, because you might not know this about me, but my background, my initial foray into journalism was professional boxing. My first job in journalism was working at the Ring magazine. I'd been into some pretty intimidating places already in my career. I'd had death threats in the middle of the night. I'd had guys pull knives on me that I was supposed to be writing about. I went to some bad gyms that and went down weird alleys that smelled like urine, and then they were like, we're not doing a story with you until you buy the gym equipment and pay for gloves and all. I mean, I was used to intimidating people. So what you do, basically, I knew this. What you do is you just stay there. You just don't leave.
Yeah.
You just stay there. Because if you cower, you're talking yourself out of it. And I don't know, maybe there's some young journalists that are listening to this podcast that they should take that lesson. When somebody scares you, you don't leave. Unless they're threatening physical violence. Intimidation and threats are two different things, and you stand your ground. And so I did, and I did diffuse it probably by saying, I turned to him and I said, come on, Dickie. I probably did it just like that, like, come on. And it goes a long way when you don't show fear. It goes a long way.
Right, and where do you think
it's something to learn. It's not just in journalism, it's in everything. If you don't show fear, if you don't show insecurity, you get a longer way in life, and tough lessons to learn. I'm over 50 years old now, and it took a long time to learn some of those things.
You've always struck me as a very just confident and sure of yourself person in the few years that I've known you. Where do you think that confidence comes from? Experience.
Just having done things and been places. You have experiences that help you in certain realms, and then in other realms you might not have as much confidence. But you try to, make it part of your core. But in being a journalist, I used to get scared, and I probably still do get scared. I remember being practically quaking calling up Bobby Frankel because he was such a tough nut to crack.
Mm-hmm.
And when people are uncooperative, you don't want to call them. And sometimes when people are very big and famous, like Dwayne Lucas, he's so approachable in person. But I never particularly liked calling him on the phone. I would much rather walk into his office and be face-to-face. So I would get anxiety when I called him on the phone, and I would get anxiety when I dealt with certain people, and I still probably do. But nothing beats experience, because like I said, that experience with those boxing people, that really helped go a long way. When I'm in a place called the Peppermint Beach Club in a freaking closet, and they close the door and stand in front of it, and another guy pulls a Bowie knife out. Well, I'm not going to be as scared as Bobby Frankel. After that happened. So, I don't know. I guess that's it.
Horse trainers
I like to joke a lot. I like to just banter and talk. So
yeah.
So that carries you. People when people are laughing, it's very disarming. So that's good. So that's always been a nice little weapon in my holster. I really analyzed how to be a good reporter for a long time. I never want to be one of these people who would hold a notebook in front of the person and just ask questions in almost a monotone, and that's how most reporters were. I was always a conversation person. I'm going to talk to you. I'm sorry I'm a reporter, but that's just what I am. But really what we're going to do is have a conversation. I would always try to make it like that I was, as little interview and as much conversation as I can have as possible is going to put me across. And I think it served me well throughout my entire reporting career, because I saw so many people that could never elevate themselves to that level. And so there was always this wall of artifice between them and their subject. Even the positioning of the notebook and just the way they addressed the subject hurt them. And I was not that.
Right. I think everyone, they approach reporters with, it's very hard for them to let their guard down, because they feel like they're just going to have the reporters out for some sort of gotcha moment. And I think you and I both, and many others who partake in more of a long-form narrative storytelling approach to nonfiction, we don't necessarily care for that. We kind of want to set up base camp and just talk to people and not just be there, helicopter in and then take off. I don't think that's in our taste and sensibilities. And I think once you're there and you prove that you're willing to hear people out and understand their worldview, they're much more willing to trust you. And I think you've experienced that with
exactly. And it doesn't. But I would say but I would say that it does. It's not just a prerequisite of long form. It's a prerequisite for dealing with people in real life, whether you're a reporter or not. It's almost. I mean, they understand the game. They understand the game. Let's say when I'm working, well, I don't work there anymore, but when I was working with Naira and I would have to call someone up for a preview, they understood it's a minute on the telephone, and we both wanted to get in and get out, and that was good for both of us. But when I was actually, when you're actually writing about someone, you don't want to go in with preconceptions. You don't want to go in with leading questions. You never want to misquote someone. And I would have conversations with people who did not know me. They knew the name Washington Post, for example, so they were going to talk to me, and that opened a lot of doors. But I would step out of my interview mode and go, look, you don't know who I am, but I would literally say this: I'm going to earn your trust, and you will never be misquoted here. Mm-hmm. And there are plenty of reporters out there who don't do these things, but I'm not going to be one of them, and you're never going to be able to say, wow, John Scheinman screwed me over with that story. That will not happen. There will be balanced coverage. You will get your voice heard, whether you're in the negative or the positive of the story, and over time you're going to trust me. So I hope you'll talk to me today. And they loved that. They loved that.
Right, and who were some of the writers and reporters that inspired you when you were coming up?
Well, I know you told me to get this whole list of books together. That is my apocalypse book. My apocalypse list. So some of the people were on there. Certainly my first boss, Bert Sugar, was a great inspiration to me. When I got my job at Ring Magazine, like most kids when they're like 18, whatever, they have pictures of a rock star on their wall, or they have a picture of a great running back, a poster on their wall. I had a picture of a sports editor on my wall, and it was Bert. And I lucked into getting a job with him. Well, I didn't luck into it. I pressed him to no end. But he was very important to me because he took no gruff, and he seemed to be standing against the tomfoolery of his enterprise and the sport that he covered. He just cut a machete through it every single time he wrote the ridiculousness of and pomposity behind professional boxing, and I loved that. And I read A.J. Liebling, The Sweet Science, and I realized, look how you can write about boxing. This is beautiful. And then I read Bill Mack's Secretariat book. Oh, look how beautifully you can write about horse racing. And then going back even further, as a kid, I think the person who most led me into being a writer and sports writer that's in the public realm was Red Smith, the great storyteller in the sports department, I guess largely in my lifetime for the New York Times. And anyone who has never read any of his anthologized work, I mean, some of it might read dated now, but what a magnificent writer. And so he was a real guiding light for me. I was a very bad student in school. I was a very bad student, but something helped me, some courses helped me along, even when I was doing poorly, that made me realize where I was going. And I did a paper on Red Smith, and I realized I can do this. I have these values in me. I look at sports the way they do, beyond it's just like an exciting game, but, more about lives, more about storytelling. And so those were big impacts for me, big impacts.
Right, and do you think that you weren't a good student just because it didn't interest you at all? It just didn't, just stimulate you in the way that...
No. But, I mean, we can't make this interview a psychology or a psychology course here or a therapy lesson, but, things just were not going right at the time. Mm-hmm. I was learning about the world in college at my own pace and in my own way, and I would not trade the experiences and the wildness that accompanied it for anything. And I'm not just talking about, beer blast or anything. I'm talking about like some important outside the bubble type learning.
Mm-hmm.
It's not part of a curriculum. It's just like learning about life and learning about art and learning about music or cinema and the way people represent the world. I mean, those were the realms I came out of. I was a cinema studies major in college, and so I was just basically holed up in movie theaters and seeing a lot of movies, and I eventually switched into journalism. But, I come out of an artistic type background, and I think that's a strong way to process and funnel and interpret the world. So here I am reading all these sports writers and gravitating to the ones that were actually writers instead of the game story writers.
Yeah.
I'm reading the columnists. I'm not reading the game story. So, those things intertwine for me. And it's, okay, here's ways writers and filmmakers and musicians represent the world. And, they all have their different format, but it's still a processing and still a filtering that is I think some ways very similar across those platforms. So it was all coming together in my head. That's how that worked.
Yeah, and you had mentioned that with speaking to people, athletes, trainers, whoever, that you did and still do to some extent experience a certain feeling of anxiety. And I ask because I have the same thing. Like, I almost get myself psyched out before talking to people, almost to the point of paralysis, that I won't pick up the phone or knock on someone's door. It's like a palpable physical reaction to having to talk to people, because I don't know, sometimes I'm feeling I'm invading their life, whatever. And how did you cope with that? I ask selfishly because I experience that all the time, and I'd be interested to see how you work through that as well.
Well, the first thing I did was when I was working at my first daily newspaper, I knew this was a problem, and so I told the editors, I said, I will never do stories about people who have just died in a car crash or in a fire. I will not do these pieces. I will not call the family and see how they felt.
Yeah.
I'm not doing them. That is too much, and I'm not going there. So I put myself in a little bit of a comfort zone right there, because I just said no.
Yeah.
But you also have to reach a point where you swallow your fear, and I think I think reporting is sort of like you have to overcome these fears in your life in general, or you're not going to have experiences. So you push yourself out there. It's almost like, Brendan, it's like when you ask a girl out on a date, how scary it can be.
Yeah.
To make that phone call. It's terrifying sometimes. You don't want to deal with rejection. It's just scary. It's just scary. And maybe it's a little belief that, maybe I'm not good enough. Okay, well, maybe that's the same belief that you're carrying into this reporting situation. He's huge. He's in the Hall of Fame. Well, who am I? I don't know.
Yeah.
That's where you are when you make a phone call. And so you said I always have carried myself as a guy who seemed very confident in myself. Well, yeah, I guess I did build myself up to that level and began to make those calls and did get confidence, because I realized no one killed me and no one had torn my head off, and but I still do get those anxieties. I do, and I just work with them. And there's a book called, what was it? I don't know. I read a lot about Mike Tyson. Mm-hmm. and Customato, and it might have been Jose Torres' Fire and Fear. A lot of people have turned on Jose Torres, including Tyson himself, if you read his autobiography. But one of the things that really was impressive and stuck with me was in Customato's training of young Tyson. He kept emphasizing the butterflies that Mike felt when he was in the ring. He kept reminding you have the butterflies, you feel the butterflies, you're scared, aren't you? And he would just keep saying this stuff to Tyson. And what he would say is, you need to live with that. You need to recognize, okay, I'm really scared. And this is a natural reaction, and this is what fear feels like. Okay, I accept that. This is what humans feel in situations like this. And then you give it a validity. You don't try to run from it. You don't try to necessarily even overcome it. You just accept, this is how I feel, and this is how I should feel, because this is my natural feeling. And when you accept it, I don't think you tame it, but you can live with it. It's not going to go away, but you learn to live with it.
Yeah, there's a scene in Lost, the first season of Lost. I don't know if you ever watched that show.
No.
Either way, Matthew Fox. He played the lead character. Jack was a spinal surgeon, and he was a resident performing the surgery, and he's retelling the story. He was cutting open this woman's spinal girdle, and just these nerves spilled out like angel hair pasta. And everyone's looking at him for the answers. And as he's relaying this, he said he felt the most palpable fear he had ever felt. And he decided that he would let that fear in for 5 seconds. And it's kind of what you're saying, just recognizing it, letting it in, don't fight it. But after that 5 seconds, granted this is fiction, but the principle applies, he then goes in and fixes her up and patches her up. But it's like not exactly running from it. It's sort of learning. It's kind of like holding its hand for a little bit and then letting it go. I think is kind of what you're alluding to in a lot of ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when you're in therapy too, it's the kind of thing they talk about as well. Okay, I've got these negative thoughts going through my head. Well, those are your thoughts, and you say, okay, there they are.
Yeah.
There they are. Here they are again. Welcome. I know you guys. Welcome to my head. I realize that you're here. I accept that, and this is the direction I'm going in.
Yeah.
But when you run from feelings and thoughts, you're not going to get anywhere. And when you begin to understand that and learn to live with that, you know what's funny? You begin to see it in other people. You begin to see that, I don't want to call it a deficiency, but you begin to see that struggle in other people that aren't doing that. And you feel good because, wow, I recognize this not only in myself but in others. But you kind of feel for them as well. You want to help people get over the hump because it's, life is hard.
Yeah.
Life is hard, and you want to, and you need to, and you've got all this stuff swirling around inside you, and a lot of them are like, primitive feelings. You barely even know where they come from, but they're there and they show up, and you got to learn to say, okay, well, this is what happens because it's always happened.
So, what are some of the other artistic media that you draw inspiration from, that you use to shape some of the stories that the nonfiction or otherwise that you write?
I don't know. I think you're overselling my writing.
I don't think so. Well, I found your writing first when I was researching my first book, as of yet unpublished, when I was on the Maryland circuit. It was following Phil Schoenthal, who I'm sure you know.
Oh, yeah, sure.
And when I was doing research on his early successes before he was sort of on his own, he was training for Mike Gill. And he had White Mountain Boy, Kiowa Prince, a bunch of some precocious 3-year-olds for Gill. But I some of you were covering him at the time, and this would have been 2004-ish, right around there. And when I came across your stories, there was a fluidity that I came across that I knew it read easy because it was, that it was labored over, and your name stuck in my head at that time when I was doing this research around 2006, then 2007. So I don't think I'm overselling your writing capacities, because your stuff reads effortlessly, which I know means that you labor over it intensely.
Well, I appreciate that. When I was drinking heavily, I said to myself, wow, you're really hungover. And so I needed to create and I'm not saying I don't want listeners to think that I have this huge alcohol problem. It's not true.
Yeah.
But if I had been drinking and then I had a story to do, I needed a bench line. And I said to myself, and I literally said this to myself, I said, your worst stuff has to be as good as their best stuff. meaning everyone I was around.
Mm-hmm.
That was I had to have that, and so that was one of the first things I put in my mind when I started to read. You know, I didn't want anyone to know I was having a bad day.
Mm-hmm.
And what that boiled down to was like really getting the mechanics of writing down. And I think it's really a lost art. I edit newspapers right now a few days a week, and people aren't teaching writing. I had people that taught me writing. I learned how to speak in a focused, active voice. I learned how to not make my lead a thesis, but actually an entree into a story. I mean, all the things that go into storytelling, I absorbed them from a variety of sources. And I mean, when I tell you that Red Smith was an early paragon of mine, if that's the right word, it's true. And I mean, if you read his work, it's immaculately written and it feels effortless. And you might as well be sitting at a bar with him and he's telling you this story.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, I want these things in my work. And so what I learned is that the quote is your best friend. And when you learn to hear people's voices and have an ear for something clever or different or something or illustrative, there's so many different things to pull from quotes. And people that are reporters set up a quote that's going to basically get a yes/no answer. Or how did you feel? I felt fine. I felt great. I gave it 100%. You have to frame a question in a way that does not elicit a cliche or a one-word answer. So a lot of making the writing better to me was fine-tuning the art of the conversation, getting back to what we were talking about. I needed to talk to people in a way that they were going to talk to me naturally. And then I needed to have a good enough eye and ear for the quotes to select the best ones and place them in the stories for maximum impact, and then let them carry the piece along. And then I had taken a lot of poetry classes, and I learned the art of whittling things down to their essence, and that kind of practice carried over to all my writing. You know, I learned to pare down. I learned to economize. You know, if I'm given 12 inches in the story, I want to still tell a story. I don't want to write the game story. I want to tell a story. And when I was covering high school sports, they would give, and I was doing really well, I must say, but when they gave out the beats, they're offering me what they thought were the plums, and I rejected them. I just said, I don't want to cover football. I don't want to cover baseball. I don't want to talk to the coaches. I want to cover tennis and girls gymnastics. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to do these individual sports, and that's why, and, boxing, individual sport, no keepers, no handlers, no dais. You just go into the gym and you talk to people. Horse racing, you go into the barn and you talk to people. The press conferences are very rare. It's more one-to-one with people who are free agents in life and not playing for a team. And they're much more realistic than the BS that you get when you cover organized sports leagues. And I've never been a beat writer that's followed a team around, except for the University of Maryland men's basketball team. But all the other things I never pursued, and I could have gone in those directions and covered baseball. I mean, I knew baseball pretty well, and I knew basketball really pretty well. And I just said, I don't want to do that. I don't want to do them because I didn't think they were open to realistic storytelling. And the one thing that I've grown over time to loathe is hagiography, because I think it's extremely dangerous. You look at the writing about Lance Armstrong that came down the pike year after year after year, and he turns out to be a fraud. I didn't want one of those kinds of stories pinned on my resume. I didn't want to be writing laudatory pieces about someone who turned out to be a fraud because I was supposed to go out there and mythologize somebody who's supposed to be some kind of role model. No, that's not what I do, and that's not what I want to do as a person. So I think all these factors that I'm going on and on and on about, they weave into who I am as a writer and reporter, and I think it served me well.
You say you learned how to hear people's voices, and I know that you take aggressive notes with in a notebook, in a big notebook, and you don't use a voice recorder as.
Oh, well, no, I've moved to the voice recorder, and I hate it, but I have moved to it, and I got to figure it out because it's so time-consuming. But that's what I've been using lately.
I find that it takes me about a ratio of 3 times as long as the recording to transcribe a recording. So if it's a minute, it will take
murdering me right now on a piece I'm working on. It is murdering me because I have 3 hours with someone, and it's not working.
And I use recorders. I like the idea of it being a catch-all net that I can then filter through and vet out, because I don't trust my handwriting and I tend to miss stuff because I'm scribbling too fast. So I do like the fact that a recorder catches everything. But it is such a pain to go back and transcribe. If I ever reach any sort of level of affluency, which things are not trending that way, I would hire someone to transcribe.
Well, it's good that we're having this conversation, because I think I kind of got lazy and just stopped using the notebook, and I think I want to go back to the notebook. With the Dickie Small piece, the recorder to me was indispensable. It was just indispensable. The piece took 3 months, maybe a little longer, from start to finish. That's a long time for a single piece, but I couldn't have done it in the way that I did it without the recorder. But for shorter term projects, like this one particular one I'm working on right now, I kind of wish I had just gone with the notebook. And you really have to think long and hard about what you're doing. It's good for very short, quick hits. If I'm chasing a jockey out of a winner's circle, I'm happy to hold a recorder right in front of them, because that interview is lasting no longer than a minute and a half.
Yeah.
If I'm getting into a realm where my interview is going to a half hour or longer, that transcribing time is taking a lot longer than the time it took to record the interview. It's taking a lot of hours. So I wish I was still using the notebook as much as you seem to think I am.
Yeah, I romanticize the notebook a lot, because I know writers like John McPhee they rail against recorders. They say that they're not, even though that they're not selective, because they catch everything. He likes to trust his ear to catch what goes from the mouth to the notebook, and then but I view the recorder as the way a photographer has different lenses. That it's a good tool to have, but not the be all and end all. And so I see it as a tool.
Did you read Joseph Mitchell? You've read Joseph Mitchell, right?
Oh yeah, I've got his Up in the Old Hotel anthology is a go-to book of me.
It's a cornerstone work for people like us. Well, very interesting. There's a biography of Mitchell that is coming out this week.
Ooh.
And Janet Malcolm, the I guess esteemed writer, reviewed it in the New York Times this week. And one of the things that she talks about, that is talked about in the biography, is that reporting is not actually accurate, and a lot of it is made up and composite work. And I've been talking to another writer friend of mine about that. Okay, John, well, how do you feel about learning that Up in the Old Hotel isn't actually this grand reporting, that he made up a lot of it and he composited people? And I have such mixed feelings about it, because in my gut, when I read Up in the Old Hotel stories, I said to myself, this is the 1940s. This guy didn't carry around a big tape recorder. How did he do this?
Mm-hmm.
How did he do this? How are these quotes like this? And he faked them. He probably didn't fake all of them, but he faked a lot of them. And I'm not going to come out and say that about McPhee, but I also have the same wonder about him a little bit. How did he do what he did? So I don't know. I'm not saying that McPhee did it. I'm not even barely suggesting it. What I'm saying is that there are writers in the nonfiction world that the work is sometimes so majestic and the quotes are so flowing. I do have that wonder while I'm reading it. Being a professional journalist, how was this done? Because I am very interested in the mechanics of writing.
Yeah.
So I was not surprised to read this about Mitchell. And whether they were composited or he made some of it up. To me, these are some of my favorite pieces of writing. So you have to make a decision. Is he a disappointment and a worse, a fabricator as a reporter who appeared in the New Yorker and showing these stories as being real, or is he just a great writer and this is what he did and you just have to accept it? And I think it's extremely complicated. But I would suggest, if you do have young listeners, to not go down that road and think you're Joe Mitchell. You better be Joe Mitchell before you start doing things that Joe Mitchell did.
Right. Yeah, and another thing that a recorder is good for is legal reasons too. If somebody says they didn't say something, as long as you didn't take their quote out of context, you can always play it back to them and say, "Here's the proof. Here's your voice. You did say this."
Exactly, but if your person never existed, you can't. Then you can. So, and we've seen this over time in journalism in the past 10 years that stories have come out about reporters who are nailed for making up people that they've interviewed that did not exist. Because when there was questions about, I don't know, plagiarism or whatever, and suddenly there's an investigation, maybe by an editorial board or editors in general to go, or even outside sources to go look at where this reporter got his information from, and then they say, oh, well, that person doesn't exist, and they're outed, and then maybe the make-believe person that they put in the story said something very compelling. But, you have to be able to trust the news, and as a news person out in the world, you better be not making it up, because you're undermining the foundation of trust in our society, and whether people, newspapers and the news itself are taking a beating as is these days. But to me, it's one of the most critical elements to an open society is to have a healthy, functioning media that has an independent voice. Absolutely.
And you're kind of changing gears a little bit. I do want to be respectful of your time, so let me get to, you already alluded to it a little bit, but I want to talk to you about your bookshelf for the apocalypse, which is just my goofy name for the 10 books or so that if you had to keep in your survival pack, if there's a global pandemic and zombies running around, and you did have to anchor yourself to a previous world where books were important, what those books would be. And I pose that question to you. What would your bookshelf for the apocalypse be?
Betty and Veronica's Christmas Spectacular in Berlin was a great comic book. No, just I don't know. This is a horrible question.
You're not the first person to say it's a horrible question.
I don't know. I don't even read a lot of books anymore right now, but what's the question? The books that I would bring would be the desert island type apocalypse book. I don't know.
I guess, yeah. In my pack, I would have my copy of Catcher in the Rye, Great Gatsby. Just these books I reread over and over again that just mean a lot to me. Or if I was building a tiny home.
I think I would have Galway Kinnell's The Book of Nightmares in there.
Mm-hmm.
My favorite book of poetry. I love this book, and it made a profound impact on me, and I do actually go and read it and reread it. I love a book by an author named, and he's a New York writer, you might know him. He works upstate, named Luc Santi, and he wrote a book called Low Life, and I think the subtitle of the book is The Lures and Snares of Old New York.
Mm.
It's sort of an alternative underground history of vice in New York City, probably from late 1800s to maybe 1920s or 30s. I love this book to pieces, and that would be a favorite book of mine. Up in the Old Hotel, I think I'd probably throw that in there. I could probably read that over and over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
I told you I really liked A.J. Liebling. And he wrote a book called The Honest Rainmaker that I haven't been able to turn too many people onto, and I don't know why, because I think it's one of the funniest books I ever read. And it's it's complete fabrication that he writes as real.
Huh.
And it's called The Life and Times of Colonel John R. Stingo, and you would love this book. And it's the Rainmaker. They actually in the book, Belmont Park brings this guy in to forecast the weather. for the races. And he sets up like a weather station / laboratory in the infield at Belmont Park with beakers with smoke coming out of them and all this. It's like he's like this guy who's able to predict the weather. So he makes it look like he's at the lab. But what he really is doing, he's going to the New York Public Library and reading like the Farmer's Almanac and just trying to play. This is a great book, and I would recommend it to you. And it mixes racing. This is the kind of book, and I've read this about Liebling, and this is the book that made me stick it in my head. I've read that A.J. Liebling, when he worked at the New Yorker, could be heard howling in his office while he was writing because he was making himself laugh by what he was putting down. I think that's beautiful. When you read this book, you'll get it because anyone who had the audacity to write this kind of idiocy that reads so beautifully has got to be making themselves happy. So that's one of them.
Great.
I loved Keith Richards' book, Life.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great book. I don't know how he did it, but he did it, and it's great. I've got books out that actually did this. There's a book called The Great Deep, The Sea and Its Thresholds. I actually think the book's been renamed, and it's by an author named James Hamilton Patterson, he's done fiction work that doesn't work for me, and he's done a lot of writing about food, which doesn't work for me, but he's also done a lot of writing about the outdoors and the natural world. And this book, to me, just is, it's sort of about, and it was written, I think, in the 90s, and you could probably get it for a penny on Amazon, but it takes various looks at coasts and reefs and island worlds and discusses the imperiled state of the world in some of the most magnificent writing I've ever read. And one of the things he does in the book, that he just keeps weaving in this character who has taken a boat off into the ocean and dived off the boat to take a swim. And when he comes up, he can't find his boat. And he's at sea level with his head, and his boat is very near. But he can't see the boat because of the swells of the waves. And so he knows the boat is near, but he can't find his boat. And so he weaves this in and out through these, really beautifully and written and thoughtful stories and well-researched stories of the imperiled state of the natural world, and also just this one person's view of, this person who's stuck in the water looking for his boat. A lot of things begins to go through his mind too. So it's fabulously written, and it's a little bit of a high wire act from that perspective, but it's wonderful.
Cool.
How many have I done here?
Ooh, button up on 10. I think overall you probably got 7 or 8.
Okay, well, I'll do 2 more.
Cool.
I really like a book called Blues People by Leroy Jones or Amira Baraka, who just died. I think he just died, maybe a year ago. But he was he became, he's a poet. He's I don't know how do you describe him? I don't know if black nationalist is the right word. Kind of a strident type character, but his bitterness came from a very real place. What this book that he wrote before he changed his name, Blues People, it's a history of how black music developed in the country, and it's absolutely fascinating because the blacks that are brought in from Africa as slaves, they were allowed to have their churches. They were allowed to have churches and go to church on Sunday because, of course, all the good white people wanted to make these savages into, good Christians. And what they were doing was they were coding. So they would go into the churches and then they were coding their and this happened in this country. They were coding their, what do you call it? Not ceremonies. What do you call it when you go to church? Do you have a what?
Sermon? I'm not really a churchgoer.
But you know what I'm talking about. They would go in there and have a church service. They would code their service. And with all these things that were from their religions back home in Africa, and they would code them into the Christian services they were being forced to do. So their styles and the things that they were doing to present Christianity to their white slave owners to make it look palatable. They were palatable. They were doing, the Christian services, but they were coding in all these things from their own religions. And this is fascinating to me. And then they begin to, and then the music develops from there. And then the kinds of songs they sing and the spirituals and all these things, they keep their own language and make their own language, but they're forced to do it in a way to make it palatable for their owners. And so it kind of becomes this whole mishmash, and this is how the music develops. And he traces it and he traces this kind of development, an oppressive development forward, and how it was an overcoming of their conditions. And then this is how popular music was created. And this was, to me, is a mind-blowing book.
Wow.
And then the last book that I'm going to give you is a book that I've read fairly recently that is, I like reading books. I don't know if you've read any Nick Tosches. I really like Nick Tosches.
No, I haven't.
Well, to me, he's one of the great literary journalists. And everything he covers is basically delves into the heart of darkness. And that's what he's attracted to. So he wrote a great book called Hellfire about Jerry Lee Lewis. And one of my favorite books is a book called Dino, that he wrote, and it's about Dean Martin and like the empty, hollow-eyed soul of Dean Martin. I couldn't really care about Dean Martin, but what a riveting book! And he wrote a book about Sonny Liston, which isn't a great book, but it's in that path. So I'm attracted to these kind of writers that get to truths by going into, sort of the darkness of existence. And this book that I read, called Nightmare Alley by a writer named William Lindsay Gresham, who actually committed suicide. And it's about life in like the sideshow carnival world, and these people, again, they come up with, well, it's interesting, it's another thing with coding, but they come up with this coding where they set up this mind reading game by, like the man who's the mind reader and the woman who's giving them the codes, right? Who's like working with the audience. And they come up with these fantastic scams, and they become bigger and bigger and bigger. And they move it into the spirit world, the spiritual world, where they get gullible rich people. They go and research records and so forth to find out people's dark secrets, and then that are rich, and so if they've been involved in a tragic death or something, they make that person think that they can bring someone back to life, but only for a huge amount of money. So this is monstrous scams that are taking place, and all sorts of double crossings, and it is the creepiest, scariest, fantastic book maybe that I've ever read. Wow. And I think very few people could stomach it, but man, a book called Nightmare Alley that goes to those places, that's a good book to me.
Fantastic. Well, like I said, I want to be respectful of your time. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast and talking shop. This was a lot of fun.
My pleasure.
For me.
I think this was a lot of fun. This was enjoyable, Brandon.
Fantastic. Well, congratulations again on the eclipse. Awesome story.
Thank you.
And I'll be sure to link up your work, and then hopefully get this thing up and running shortly, and we'll be able to blast it out so that everyone can hear your wisdom in the trade.
Yeah, and they'll be like, that guy's crazy.
And that would be perfect. All right. Well, thanks again, John, and we'll be in touch for sure.
Okay, Brandon. Take care.
You too. Take care. I want to thank you again for listening to the #CNF podcast. If you get a chance, head over to BrendanO'Mara.com and sign up for email updates. It's just a weekly newsletter that has the latest posts that I've written for the week, links to stuff that I've written, stuff that I admire, and updates on the podcast, obviously. Also, if you want to find another way to connect, I'm on Twitter @BrendanO'Mara, and Instagram just Brendan O'Mara. Beyond that, thanks for listening. If you get a chance to give the podcast a review, that would help. If not, no big deal. I just appreciate the fact that you made it this far and you're still listening. So in any case, stay tuned for more episodes, and that's about it. Thanks again.